First, I'll give a brief, this is my brief background to React for all you people who are new at it. I'll just do a couple slides from an older talk that I had. So ReactJS. You may have seen this photo before. Note it only goes up to last year. I don't know what the zeitgeist will favor in 2016, but maybe we're all passé already. Sorry, everyone. Angular 2, I don't know. I'm not into Angular 2. I still like React because HTML in your JavaScript makes so much more sense than JavaScript in your HTML, which is exactly what React and the rest of them are doing with their templating languages. Anyway, we might talk more about that. I love this graph. So this is how concerned the library is with the task, not an opinion on how good it is at it. I didn't make this. What's his name? I forget the guy who made this. It was from JSConf 2014 in a talk called Embular Actimer Bone, where he compared the 5. And it shows Ember on the far left. Cares a whole lot about how you interact with your data, with your API. It cares a whole lot about how you do your rendering, how you do your user interaction, how you do your routing, and how you organize your project. Note it's the only one that cares at all about how you organize your project. React only cares about rendering and user interaction, right? So that's, all of you who do React already know this. React is just that view layer, and if you want the routing and the data API stuff, then you need all kinds of other pieces to hook into it. So yeah, this is what it looks like, and we'll move on to my main talk now. So Quizzical, Quixotic, those are the names that I used. That last one, Quixotic, is about Don Quixote, which has nothing to do with this talk. This talk is about managing state, which gets messy sometimes. Before we get into that, a little bit about me. My name is Chad Ostrowski. I live in the Milky Way galaxy, about right there, on a water planet called Earth. This is how I fit into the local biosphere. And I live in a city called Philadelphia, a little south of this one. I work at Citrusbyte, and we have employees all over the world. So there are a few here in New York who organize this wonderful meetup. And I'm a Philly outpost. You can find me online at twitter.com/Chado, GitHub Chado, and Chado everywhere. All right, so managing state. First, a little bit. I keep doing these side things, but it's cool. So I have a side project that I work on. Citrusbyte is super cool because they encourage working on side projects, and it's actually in the intellectual property agreement that you sign that you own the stuff that you work on the side, which is super cool. So I have this side project called entire.life, and when you first sign up for it, you get this onboarding quiz where it asks you little questions. Like, are you married? And you can say yes or no. And the UI responds to what you say and puts in, it gives you appropriate follow-up prompts. So it's simple and fun to use. If you want a demo, I can give you a demo. Should I go use it right now? All right. So if you go to the actual URL is entire.life, which you probably can't see. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Yeah, that's really tiny up there. The URL is entire.life. Anyway, so if I sign in here, this is showing, dang, the screen is huge. This is awesome. This is showing every year of my life. So this is when I was 0 years old. So this whole first row, each dot is a week of my life. And if you go down, it shows up to when I'm 100 years old. I have a plan to ride a bike on my 100th birthday. So when you first sign up, it will bring you to this little onboarding quiz. And should I make it bigger? Let's make that bigger. Look at that. All right. So when's the last time you moved? And 06, 01, 2014, where to, Chester Ave. And this is going to seed the person's calendar with some dummy data, or like some real data that they can look at. So I can say that my younger brother is Seth. He was born on 8/8/88. I'll just skip the rest of these. So this is the one that I showed that video of, right? And anyway. All right, let's go back to this. So if you think about just that piece of the UI, it's kind of, you can represent it with a flow chart. It's like perfectly represented by this flow chart. Are you married? Yes. To whom? When was your wedding? Done. Otherwise, in a serious relationship, yes. What's your partner's name? When did you start dating? And for each of those, it's going to create an event on your calendar, and it's going to customize the event based off of what you put in. So for the first one, you have the bride with veil emoji, and you say married spouse's name versus a little heart emoji. So a naive approach to building this is basically a bunch of if statements. So we'll walk through that. And this is how I started out, right? But this first part is easy. You just say, are you married? And then on change, we're going to set the state for this component to married yes or married no. Cool. Then we'll move on. So are you married? And then that whole thing where we were setting the state is hidden inside that ellipsis. And you have to say, if married equals yes, then render this whole thing. If married equals no, render this whole thing. If we follow this through, you'll end up with this kind of thing. For if you're married, then you say to whom. If they've filled out to whom they are married, then show when was your wedding. If they've filled that out, then show the save button. And the whole thing ends up looking kind of like that, which it's a little bit small maybe, but you can see like it's indenting at each level. You can almost see that flow chart kind of showing through here, right? Also, note that you have, if not this state wedding, this .render save button, and then you have the render save button again, and then you have the render save button again. So maybe we can pull those all out, but it still doesn't really look cleaner. And something I don't like about it especially is I'm going to have lots of these questions that I ask people, so I want some way to like have them all go through this flow the same way, right? I don't want to have to, if I wrote it like this, then I'd have to write every single one in this very similar way. And I want to be able to reuse it. So if we take a step back, what that's almost looking like is this. This is basically that flow chart, but as a JavaScript object. Are you married? Answer, yes or no. And then prompt after that, to whom? And then that answer is only going to be a spouse name. So I want to use this. I just want to feed this into something. How do we get there? Basically, I want my component to look like this. So I have this relationship question. Are you married? Are you in a long-term relationship? So I'll set up some state with an answer object. It's going to need to, this save method is going to need to use whatever answers they provide. So that state, those answers need to be in this component, not in the child component. So that's why this state is managed here. The prompts are what we saw a couple slides ago. And then we're just going to pass all of those prompts into this question component and say, when they answer it, set the state and pass in the state's answers for now, or from here. So again, I want to say, like, remember the structure here. So each prompt is going to have the prompt and then the answer, and then each answer is going to have the prompt and an answer, and then the next follow-up prompt, or the next, whichever, yeah, you get it. And then that answer will have prompt and an answer, maybe a type, because we want it to be some other kind, not just text, but we want to be able to have a date input. But we'll kind of ignore this type part and just go through as if all of them just have a prompt and an answer. So if we go to this, we're going to start building this question component. And we're going to just return a div, and we're going to say this, render prompts. Let's write the code that we wish we had. So we do this render prompts thing. What does render prompts look like? Render prompts is a little bit tricky. It's recursive. So it's returning an array. That's something fun to note. I didn't realize at first that you can just return an array in React and it will render each specific thing in that array. So I'll be using that trick a lot. It'll render them all as like sibling components. You don't have to nest them all inside something else. So that's handy for this. And then we'll push in the first prompt. We'll render that somehow. We'll figure out based off of whether it has multiple answers or just one, if it's going to be multiple choice, that kind of thing. And then if that prompt is answered, we call this same thing again. So, and we pass in the next prompt. So let's walk through each piece of this. Let's do render prompt. Render prompt is, like I said, and this, I'm doing a lot of ES6, ES 2015, ES 2016 kind of syntax. Feel free to stop me and ask about it. This ... is saying, here's right, you're starting a new object, and you're saying break out all of the pieces of this object. So prompts is an object. It's going to have a key prompt. It's going to have a key answer. And this render prompt is being passed the prompt, and it's being passed the answer, and then it's being passed the index. Also, is everyone good with this? Or who is not good with this? Eh? All right, cool. So let's look at some code. So if you do render prompt, or let's go down to this call here. Can you see it? So this is one thing you can know first, or you should know first about ES6. So instead of doing index, that's long-winded, we can just get rid of that, and it's automatically expanding it for us. So that's cool. And then if we do like that ... prompts thing, that's going to pass in and have whatever's in prompts, right? So prompts is going to look something like this. Prompt, are you married? Answer, some other object. So when you do this ... prompts thing, it's going to result in an object that looks like prompt, are you married? Answer, that object, and then index is, well, it's going to be 0 for this first one. So that's what we're ending up with there. Going back to this. So let's look at that render prompt thing. It's being passed the prompt, the answer, and the index. And the reason we're passing through this index is because we're going to need to keep track of which ones they've answered in this series so far. So that's kind of how we're keeping track of, like, this is what's answered, this is what's not. So if the answer, oh, actually, that's something I didn't point out. But the last prompt has no answer. It's just a save button. So that's what we're going to do first when we render that individual prompt. We're going to say, if it doesn't have an answer, just return the prompt, return that save button, essentially. Then we're going to pull the answers out of the, so this is going to be an object. You can do object.keys to get an array of all of those. So it'll be like yes, no, or maybe it'll just be spouse name. So are you married? And then the prompt will be, are you married? Answer will be yes and no. So if the answers.length is greater than 1, we render multiple choice. Otherwise, we render a free form field. Are we good here? All right. Render multiple choice. So it's passed a prompt, it's passed the choices, and it's passed that index again. This is doing the thing where it returns an array again. So you can see the comma here after this first bit of JSX. And the reason I did that, I didn't have to for this one. I like doing that because it gives you, you don't have to do a wrapping div, right? You're not bloating the content on the page. You're not potentially messing up styling. It's just a p tag, then another p tag. That's all I wanted. And if you return an array, you can get that. But then whenever you do those arrays, everything needs a key. Otherwise, React says, like, whoa, your stuff in your array doesn't have a key. Give it a key. So that's why everything has a key here. And then we're going to go through, and we're going to render each choice. So I also want to say, like, note how nice and small all of these functions are versus like that render function where we had all the basically nested if statements that was really unwieldy. But these are all like nice and small and understandable. Render choice, it's given, so this will be like yes or no, and then the index is going to be 0 for now. We're pulling the answers out of the props. So this is like writing, I'll just put this here. So if I do, we'll put it here. So if I said answers equals this dot props, that's the same as doing const answers equals this dot props dot answers. It's just a shorthand for that, basically. It's pulling that key out of it. This is called destructuring in ES6, which definitely takes some getting used to. And const is like var, but it's a constant. So that's kind of self-explanatory. All right, so we're going to render this choice. We're going to need the answers, and the reason we need the answers is to know if it's checked. So we're going to check answers 0 and see if it equals yes, for example. And if it equals yes, then that option is checked. The rest of this is pretty straightforward. The key needs to be not just the choice or just the index, because you're going to have multiples for both of those, potentially. So just add them together, get a unique string. And then the name can be, sure, 0. Value is going to be yes. On change, we're going to answer prompt. So we'll look at answer prompt soon. Note that answer prompt is being passed choice, which is going to be equal to yes, and the index. For the render freeform, it's pretty similar to the render multiple choice. It's passed a prompt and a field rather than a prompt and choices. Key is going to use that index again. Label will have the prompt, and then the input field is going to have the, it's going to be named for that field. On change, we're doing answer prompt again. And this time, instead of passing it choice and index, we're passing it field and index. Answer prompt, it can be passed choice, it can be passed field, it's always passed index. So it deals with either of these. Also, it's returning a function. The reason it's returning a function, when you do the on change this dot answer prompt, right, I'm like doing a function call here. Usually if you did your function call right in line, that would cause problems because it's expecting to be passed something like a function it can call. So it's going to call that function every time the input is changed, and it's going to send it the event, the change event. So that's what's happening here. This E is the change event. And so you're binding all of these things. You're kind of like, you can use all of them inside this function. So the answers, this is a little different than that one before, right? I'm doing this object with the dot, dot, dot thing. And what's that do? That's duplicating the whole thing so that you have a brand new object so that React knows, oh, this thing changed, and it can update your state correct. It can update your UI correctly because it's not, you're not accidentally mutating the existing answers somehow. I'm not even sure if that's possible, but with how React works, but just that's, you know, philosophically what I want to happen. So I'm writing the code that I want philosophically, I guess. So then we're going to set, this answers at the beginning, right, is just going to be an empty object. And we're going to say answers 0 equals yes. Or the next time through, it's going to say answers 1 equals choice will not be passed because it's free form. So it'll have a field instead. So it'll say answers 1 equals Lisa, for example. And then if field is set, also set that. So we're kind of duplicating it. So it'll be answers 1 is Lisa, answers spouse name is Lisa. And then we're setting the state in the parent component. That's what that on answer did. All right, so that brings us back to render prompt. We should be able to understand everything in render prompt now. Any questions on it? Anything that people are still, or what are your questions? That's what you're supposed to ask. What are your questions on this? All right, cool. Everyone understands it. So that brings us back to this. We now know how this whole part works once we put that first prompt on. Now we need to see how isAnswered and next prompt are defined. By the way, I noticed as I was writing this is actually returning like a bunch of subarrays. So you have like prompt 1 that you push in here, and then this is going to return, you're pushing in the result of render prompts, which is going to be another array. So you actually have prompt 1 and then a subarray, prompt 2, and then another subarray, prompt 3. And it turns out this doesn't matter. React deals with this just fine. It flattens the array and it displays all of your prompts or all of your, XML-ish stuff. So React deals with that just fine, which is pretty cool. Maybe cleaning up this code so it doesn't do that is a good idea, but it's not causing problems for the moment. So is answered, we're just going to look at this.props.answers index, and that's why we're setting both. So here I'm showing, and maybe I should have shown it at the top, but this.props.answers is going to be something like 0, yes, 1, Lisa, and spouse name Lisa. And the reason it's doing that spouse name one is so that we can use it in our save function in the parent component. So we need both. For the next prompt, we say prompts.answer this.props.answers index. So this.props.answers 0, and that will return the multiple choice one. Or we can do, if the multiple choice one is not there, then it's going to try to look it up this way, which is going to work for the freeform thing. So it's just doing object.keys of prompts.answer. So it would be spouse name, an array with spouse name, and we just pull spouse name out, and we say prompts.answer spouse name. So we always end up at this new array here, right? Cool. And that's the whole thing. It works. So going back to the relationship question, this is all it has to look like. And we have our prompts, and we have our prompts here. And then we pass it all into this question component. And we just saw basically all of question. I left out a few very small pieces. And we're able to have that. Or we're able to have that. When's the last time you moved? Type date. And when they answer, we ask where to. And so all of these questions can be defined super quickly just using basically their flowchart. And then you can kind of analyze very quickly what's going on at any step in that flowchart, right? Like all of the logic is not hidden deep inside all of your markup. It's right there and visible for you to see, and you can quickly scope out these whole kind of flow charts of how you want the user to work through this quiz. I just put them all in here, all 6 of the ones I have. This one's fun. So the answer is yes, this one is no. You can just do a string there, and everything still works. It's happy with that. Also, it's very composable, right? You can say car this.last prompt. So all of them are just going to return whatever last prompt returns, which is this new object. And by the way, that's another, this whole like parenthesis thing is going to return this object. So it's a way to avoid having a return statement within your function. So I did that for these slides because it cut out a couple lines and made it nicer to look at. And then I was like, you know what, I like this, and I kept it. What do you want to do on your 100th birthday? This one is pretty different from the other ones. All of the options are rendered from this array, so it kind of loops through them. And it sets up this next, right? Because you want a bunch of answers where all they're going to do is render the save button, no matter which one you pick. So that's just a way to loop through and say, like, these are all of the different options, and they all have the same exact follow-up state. So that's the whole thing. That's what I have. My conclusions from this whole experiment are React is awesome. I like React. I don't know. I haven't thought too much about it, but I feel like doing something like this in Angular or Ember or anything that uses templates would I would feel more restricted to that original approach where I was doing basically a bunch of nested, a big if tree within my markup. And with React, I was able to construct this thing where I'm just passing in this whole like nicely visually parsable object. And React, you can deal with that. React is just JavaScript. Return array for the win. That is super handy. Yeah. And if statements suck, but you don't need them. So cool. Should this be on NPM? Question for all of you. Is this something that you think would be useful to other projects, or does it already exist on NPM and I didn't know about it? Some kind of React flowchart or React flow, or you're a quiet bunch. It should be on NPM, someone shouted meekly.
My rule of thumb is if you had to build it for yourself, you may as well put it up there and see if others need it.
Okay. If you're going to build it for yourself, you may as well put it out there and see if others need it, he suggested.
It's actually Fred Wilson's thesis.
What's that?
It's actually Fred Wilson's thesis, not mine.
It's Fred Wilson's thesis, not yours. Okay. Yeah, so it's not on NPM right now. I'm actually not super experienced with I've built one other thing that I put on NPM, another React library for an emoji picker for the same project. And ideally, it would work like Slack's emoji picker, but it's not quite there yet. But I didn't use any ES6 or JSX or anything in that because I couldn't figure out how to do the whole like build it before you publish it thing. So like I'm new to this. So if someone wants to help me get it on NPM or just like get that thing started, that would be super cool. I'll be around after and we can talk. Where I implemented all of this, you can see it. Entire.life right now is all open source. It might not stay that way, but you can go find it on my GitHub there. Yeah, if you want the slides, you can email me. Questions? Please ask questions. Yes?
So when you return an array, I don't know if you ever tested it with like a circular JSON. Like would it still plan out the circular JSON correctly?
When you return an array, have I ever tested it out with a circular JSON? What's that?
The return in the render.
The return in the render, right.
Yeah.
So you're saying like if my prompts in my question, so like my relationship question, if I had a circular structure in here,
Yeah.
that just seems like a bad idea though.
There's times when it's like convenient and it's even unavoidable.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm not sure how that would, like, this feels very defined to me, like but I don't see how it would deal with that well. I feel like that would cause problems. Like you would end up with an infinite page, basically. As the user answered one thing, it would show the next, and it would end up in like a loop where it kept showing the same things over and over. Which maybe that's what you want to do. I don't know. Yes.
I think part of the answer is that React Render will accept an array of JSX elements, but not a JSON object.
Right.
You can't pass it a circular JSON object.
Right. So you can't. So in that render function, right. So I'm doing render prompts. Render prompts is returning an array, not an object. We're not returning like some kind of JSON object here inside render prompts. So you can't pass render a. Actually, I think even if you do in the root render, if you do an array, it doesn't like it. It's just kind of for those like as you build up the things inside. But yeah, you can't just pass. Like I couldn't just pass that prompts thing into it as it is. I need to like coerce it into this array of individual prompts. Does that kind of clear it up? Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
I know that specifying a key for every element in an array that gets rendered somewhat restricts how React re-renders if it needs to. I was wondering if there are any performance implications for using that all over the place.
The question is about with all the keys that this question thing is putting in all over the place, yeah. Key equals, does that have performance implications because of how React re-renders things? Now it keeps track of where things are with keys. The questions that I'm rendering are very small, right? So if you were doing the infinite page thing with like the recursive prompts, maybe you'd run into problems at some point, but that's, yeah. I mean, for like four little prompts, it's fine. Yeah.
Well, the whole point of your model is to re-render within a question, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Re-render, like each new question pops up in a new.
The fact that you're setting a new, something new that causes a new render, that's the intended design.
You mean as I click here, it does a re-render?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So you do want to re-render each of those.
Well, but it'll recycle using the input. It'll change less of the DOM through React Auto Magic, like if.
But it's still, every time it changes something, it's rendering the same. It's rendering one little thing. It's not rendering a whole bunch of options.
Right. Each time it changes, it's going to update the state, and it might pop in the new, right? Like it'll pop in that new question. But now that that question's there, it's not re-rendering this, it's not re-rendering that or these. It'll re-render this span inside this, but that's it. So I think React is pretty smart about how it re-renders this stuff. But your question about the keys, like, so like each of this prompt has its own key, and this input has its own key. This p tag that these inputs are in have their own key. I don't know. I haven't noticed any problems with it.
Isn't it good practice to pass keys into elements?
Isn't it good practice to pass keys into elements? You need them if they're from an array. If you're returning a bunch of things from an array, then you need those keys. And that's so if you resort the array, React can be smart about how it re-renders them. So that's kind of the point of the keys. Like if you don't put a key in and you never resort your elements, React will be fine. But if you resort your elements and you don't have keys, then you might end up with a like really goofy interface. So that's my understanding of like why the keys are there. And like here you just need them so React doesn't complain, which maybe like you can just ignore in your development environment because it's not going to be doing that check in production anyway. So maybe I don't need keys. Yeah?
So your naive approach, what was your journey like going from that to this nested, awesome prompt type thing?
Yeah, we can. So I started out with the, I never committed anything with the, oh, come on, GitHub URLs. I never committed anything with the naive approach. I started committing with something a little bit better. This is where I changed it all to this new thing with the flowchart. You can see that I finally merged it 3 hours ago. Ha. So if you look at how it used to be, I kind of had, this might be going into too much, but I had each question did stand on its own. But it was kind of this intermediate step where I was doing stuff like returning arrays, right? So this prompts here, I was using this prompts and I was just saying like, I want prompt 1 and I want the skip prompt. And this is how I defined prompt 1. And it was returning this array. So it like started to kind of have some of the characteristics where I was like, oh, this is how I can pull this apart. This is how I can make this, like abstract all of this to its own component. And then what it's doing at the bottom is it's just rendering, or what it was doing, is it was rendering this.state.prompts. So it was setting all of these prompts in the state. It had these default prompts. And every time you selected something, it would fire a different, like every single option that you clicked fired a different function. And it would update the state with new prompts. So that's what I was doing at that point.
Was this a like you imagine doing it this way with this like structured JSON and you figured out how to do it, or was it like you hacked your way into it?
Yeah, I wrote some JSON that didn't look quite like these, right? I wrote some JSON that was like a little more, it was like, well, JavaScript doesn't work this way, right? I wrote some, like my first approach whenever I was writing it out was more like, I would have this.state.answers child name as the key, or I would have this.props.save button, a function call, as the key. And it's like, you can't have a function as a key in JavaScript. Keys have to be strings. So I kind of, like at first, whenever I built it the way that I just showed you, I wrote some kind of JSON like that, and I was like, JavaScript doesn't have the tools to let me do this, and I got sad, and I wrote it the way that I just showed you. And then as I was thinking about it more and preparing for this talk, I was like, man, I remember writing like my flowchart as a JavaScript object. I want to use a JavaScript object here. I don't want to have all this stuff that I just did. So I like kind of massaged the JavaScript, this object, until it was like, this is actual JavaScript. Like I could actually work with this. And it definitely took some iterations then. Like as I started working through it, it was kind of, you know, as I walked through all of like render prompts and all that kind of stuff, I was like, oh, I need to change the structure of that flowchart. I need to change the structure of that object. So it was kind of just working through it step by step. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on testing this kind of structure, so the interpretation of the prompts and then corresponding components and interactions with those components using Jest or some other testing?
Do I have insights on testing this? Unfortunately, I do not. That would be a good thing to get. Yeah, and if I make it its own library, it really should have tests, right? So that would be a good thing to explore. I have done some testing with components. It's been a while, and I'm kind of rusty, so I can't think of how I would, like. But you can set the state at the beginning, right? So you can, and you're passing in, basically, actually, I think it'd be pretty easy because you're passing in here, you're passing in prompts to this question component, right? So you can say, like, if I pass in prompts that look like this, then I expect it to look like this. And if I pass in answers that look like this, right? It's all based off of what you're passing in. So like if the answers to these prompts are there, then it's going to show a different part of the tree. So you'd be able to test it just by setting up the prompts like you would, setting up the props like you would in a normal component. Other questions?
Yeah. More of a comment. If you do open source it, you could sort of specify your own schema.
Specify what?
Your own schema, your own JSON schema, along with the project. And okay, so then only quizzes, only JSON objects that follow such and such format are going to be parsable by the software.
Okay. There was a suggestion, if it is open source, you can create your own like JSON schema, basically, and say like the prompts that are passed into this thing need to fit this schema. It must have a prompt, and it must have an answer, that kind of thing. It's a good idea. And it may have a type, and it may have a name, right? That's kind of how that works. Yeah. Yeah, that would be cool.
It's about 8 o'clock, so.
It's about 8 o'clock, so I guess we timed it perfectly. All right. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.